Thank you so much. And thank you for the invitation to come here today. I've been really excited about coming to this area and know more about the border. So what I'm going to do today is two things. First, I'll have a short presentation about my work, and then we are going to watch a film, because as I'm an anthropologist and researcher, but I'm also a film director, and I'm combining my work with making films based on my research. So during the day we have talked a lot about the smugglers and the migrants, and I think it's continuously important to have their voice, whether it's the smugglers, whether it's the migrants, to know their perspective and learn more. So we are going to watch a film told from the perspective of a Nigerian woman who have tried several times to reach Italy. But first, what I will introduce you slightly to not only my work, but also to how I as an anthropologist work with the concepts of smuggling and human trafficking. I'm doing my research in Nigeria and in Thailand, and it is estimated that there are between 6 to 8 places globally from where women in particular migrate to the sex industry in Europe. And I'm working in 2 of those places, southern Nigeria and northeast Thailand. I'm not going to talk about Thailand today, but often in the European context we forget that we also have people coming undocumented or smuggled from Asia and on the increase. But today I'm going to talk about the West African European context. We have seen this map a couple of times already, though this is slightly different. So I'm working with the central route, this one. And my fieldwork is right here in Benin City, southern Nigeria. And before we heard about the different migration hubs, Benin City in southern Nigeria is a significant migration hub from where many documents are made, fake documents are made, and where a lot of migrants from West Africa, they will go to Benin City and travel onwards from there using the central route. In the past 15-20 years, we have seen an increase in Nigerian women, in particular traveling from that area, and that is the group that I'm going to talk about today. So before we also talked about whether it's possible to send messages back to the migrant communities, warning them about the dangers. And because there has been such a concern with the trafficking of women into the sex industry in this particular area in Benin City and the villages around there, there has been warning campaigns for several years, warning women not only of the dangers of smuggling and crossing the Sahara and the Mediterranean, but to end up in the sex industry. So Benin City is a quite good case in talking about how migration campaigns or warning campaigns are actually working. And despite the fact that millions of dollars have been used, you can see here that there's a steep increase in migration from Nigeria. And they have a quite good knowledge about the journeys that they're going through, and still we see this increase. What is significant is that compared to other migrant groups, 25% of the Nigerian arrivals to Italy and Malta are women. And if we compare that to, for instance, migrant groups from Mali, Mauritania, other parts of West Africa, it's only 1% or up to 5% that are women. So my point is just to say that it's we need to know more. If we want to know about women's involvement in smuggling and human trafficking and how they end up as victims of human trafficking, we need to know more about the areas from where they migrate from. And we need to know why there's a significant ratio of women from some areas, and why these gendered migration systems, how they occur. So I'll also talk a bit about how that happens. When we talk about human trafficking, it's often assumed that women do not know anything about what kind of sector they are going into and that they are forced against their will to sell sex. And I'm not saying that this doesn't occur, but in the Nigerian case, you would say, and Nigerian migrant sex workers are the largest group of sex workers in Europe, with the Eastern European women and Thai women. 15 years ago, women didn't know a lot about what kind of sector they were going into. So we also have to understand the temporality of knowledge, so to speak, that many years ago they maybe didn't know so much, but now everyone knows what type of job they're going to have in Europe. And so their migration is organized through what I termed indentured sex work migration or indentured labor, meaning that they migrate knowing that they are going to pay back a lot of money when they arrive in Italy and in Europe. And I think we also pay, you can say, too little attention to the role of debt in migration, because when we talk about the poorest of the poor, that they don't migrate, what is actually a change here is that the poorest of the poor, they do migrate because they borrow money in order to migrate. And they make these indentured labor systems that they agree to pay off. The women that I work among, they borrow, depending on the quality of the document, the fake documents, the quality of the route, and the quality of the labor that they have been promised, between $12,000 and up to $70,000. And they have to pay off those money over 2, 3, 4 years. So it's a system of indentured labor migration that we have known for many, many years when we talk about migration. But this is a continuity of that. And I just wanted to point out that I think it's often very important to actually follow the money when we talk about economic migration and trafficking and what is it that make people leave. So per client, a woman working in Lagos in Nigeria, she gets $3 per client, $27 in Barcelona, and $91 in Copenhagen in Northern Europe. So it's also to say that that if we follow the money, we of course understand even more why these women continue to leave. Very often we talk about human trafficking as, again, enforced and against the will of the person who are involved. And we know from very much ethnographic research now that the level of knowledge and the level of voluntariness involved in trafficking is significant. And that, of course, really, you can say, deconstruct some of the ideas we have about human trafficking, that you can actually slowly become involved or involved in your own exploitation. And that's a major challenge for the way that we understand human trafficking, that it's not, and you will see that in the film, it's not women being taken away from the village against their will, which has often been the imagination of human trafficking. It is women and men, because there are also a lot of men being trafficked, that slowly get more and more involved in networks where they have to pay back money, they made different promises. So it's a slow process where people make decisions, or they feel that they make informed decisions. So the definition that most trafficking scholars are using for human trafficking is that it is that we can't only look at it within a crime framework. We have to understand how these three things are intertwined. The drive for cheap and flexible labor, the state concerns to maintain borders, and that points to the two earlier presentations, how I have worked with human trafficking for 15 years, and while I've been doing that, the prices that the women, there's an increase in the debt. So the more difficult it is to enter Europe, the higher the debt. and then migrants' desire for opportunities to improve their lives. And that points, of course, back to the areas from where they migrate from, because remittances for so many years have come back to Benin City, to southern Nigeria. And that is, as we talked about before, one of the major ads for continuous migration. In the Q&A, I think we could talk more about some of the questions that my research are that I'm working on currently, and that is how do we define trafficking versus smuggling? And in my work, the main difference is that smuggling for the Nigerian women migrants and also for the men migrants are it's a question of the transport across the Sahara and across the Mediterranean, whereas trafficking is the question of exploitation of labor, and it's a much longer process. So the smuggling for them is often people they don't know, and it's short term, whereas the exploitation of labor is a long-term process. Which means that many of the migrants that arrive in Europe that I work with, they say that they understand trafficking as a safer way of migrating than smuggling. And why is that? It is because they say that when you're going to work for someone and you owe that person money, you are an investment. So you need to arrive more safely at the shores of Europe. So the women working in the red light districts in Europe, they will say that it's more safe for them to owe someone money that they have to pay back over time than to simply be smuggled. And I think that changes our perspective on how we understand trafficking and smuggling, because if you are an investment, you need some of the people that facilitates your migration will take better care of you. That's what they say. They also prefer that in this framework of organized crime that we have also tried to kind of deconstruct somewhat, they would say that the more organized, the safer for them, which also challenge our understanding of organized crime, because previously, 15 years ago, across the Sahara Desert, many of the women, and I have interviewed several of them who migrated many years ago, they would take a pickup truck. You will also see that in the film. The pickup truck will collapse during the desert, and there would be no one there to pick them up, and people would die. And it's not that people are not dying in the desert anymore, but now it's so organized that there will very shortly arrive a new pickup truck. So the more organized and the more that are offering smuggling, the more safe for them and the better it is for the madams who are organizing these trips for the women to choose between different kind of smugglers that cross the Mediterranean, so they can choose better ships with less people on board, all these kind of things. So I think it also challenges our ideas on organized crime and safety during these journeys. Also, what we have seen, and this is in the past year, that the prices that I mentioned before of up to $65,000 or $70,000, they are on the decrease. So that some of the women that arrive now, they are younger, and they don't owe as much. $25,000, which is of course still a lot, but not compared to the other prices. And I think we can explain that by, again, the more organized, the easier to negotiate and make bargains. But that's something that we are looking into. Then we also have the smuggling and or trafficking involvement to finance own migration. So someone in the audience asked about how women's involvement are in the smuggling. And it's true that we don't see as many women in the smuggling business across the Sahara and across the Mediterranean, but we see a lot of women as recruiters and they do that often to finance their own migration. So if I have several cases of that. You agree that you would pay, say, $60,000 back over the next 3 years, but you can have that price reduced to $30,000 if you find 5 other women who will travel with you. And that's really a way that many of these systems. So you are involved in the recruiting, smuggling, trafficking in order to reduce your own travels. And then maybe of interest to you, in terms of your border, is that many of the Nigerians are now considering, and we don't know if they will actually do that, but many of the people that I have interviewed, they say that they would consider going elsewhere because it's simply becoming so difficult to get to Europe. And it's becoming difficult to earn a lot of money in Europe, so it's not so much because it's more dangerous, but simply where can you earn the money? And there are new markets so we will see more south-south migration because you can make money now in China, the Middle East, South Africa, and several of my informants also mentioned that they wanted to travel to Argentina, Brazil, and then onwards to the US. So I don't know if you meet any Nigerians, but they certainly talk about that. And just as you see, I mentioned that it's not the anti-sex work policies, because one way that has often been suggested to reduce the trafficking of women to the sex industry is to criminalize the clients, and that would be a way to reduce the demand. But it's very evident that when you look at these areas from where the women are migrating, they don't care about sex work policies, they care about migration policies. So you can't really reduce migration by working on the anti-sex work policies. But as said, I think it's important to look at how the people involved explain their journeys themselves. So this was the end of the presentation, and then I'll show you the film, and then you'll have a Q&A.